The CWD Symposium presents The Bond Between Science and Disability, Forging New Capabilities for Inclusion, which was featured at the 256th ACS National Meeting in New Orleans. We are honored to have Dr. Hobby Wedler give a PowerPoint presentation on pairing chemistry with blindness.
Morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this ACS meeting and at this prof session. I'm very grateful to Lee Hoffman for the time and energy he put into designing and implementing this session and making this a great place for all of us to share what we do. I've titled this presentation, if you will give me 1 second to get things situated. Pairing Chemistry with Blindness, a Journey Through Graduate School and Beyond. So I want to preempt my talk just a bit by telling you that what I'm going to tell you about definitely is experience from graduate school. However, I will also include some information about what I'm doing now and perhaps why I chose to make the switch from a career in academia to a career in industry where we're designing things and making things do what they do and really enhancing that overall user experience of products and designing custom experiences to just make people think a little bit differently about what they do, perhaps. So universal accessibility is absolutely key in the work that I do and the work that I did in graduate school. And I want to, it's part of my design mission at this time. And when I talk about universal accessibility, what I really am referring to is not only making things accessible to folks who are blind or visually impaired or folks with disabilities in general, but really making products and experiences accessible to everyone. My findings have been in chemistry and beyond that if we make something universally accessible, if we make it usable for me, it ends up being very useful and accessible for my peers and colleagues. So that's a really important thing. If we make one thing accessible for one person, we're making it available and accessible to everyone, to the community that we live in at large. But what I'm showing here on this slide is the image of a curb cut or wheelchair ramp. And I'll just tell you a little bit of a story. In the 1960s, in the late 1960s, I also got an undergraduate degree in history, so bear with me while I nerd out about history for a minute. In the 1960s, a group of students led by a man named Ed Roberts from the University of California, Berkeley, led a campaign just locally in the town of Berkeley to put in wheelchair ramps or curb cuts so that they could get from the street up to the sidewalk or the pavement, the asphalt up to the pavement. Ed Roberts and his group of friends and supporters were called the Rolling Squad. They were all in wheelchairs. And they moved from UC Berkeley to City Hall weekly to advocate for this. Now, City Hall was opposed to it at first and then eventually caved and did it, and it was a big success in the town of Berkeley. Ed Roberts and his crew went on to advocate for curb cuts in the state of California. The state of California said, man, this is interesting. We're not sure if we're willing to do it. Talk to the federal government. They talked to the federal government. One thing led to another, and it was a very long and drawn-out process whereby the U.S. government at first said, no, we can't afford this. This is ridiculous. We're not going to put curb cuts everywhere, at every intersection in the United States. And then eventually they decided that, well, okay, fine, maybe this is a worthwhile thing. We'll do it, but we're only supporting one group. Mind you, this is in 1978, which is 12 years before the passage of the ADA, so there wasn't really precedent here, and they reluctantly decided to install curb cuts around the country and found, to their excitement, surprise, you name it, that curb cuts were wildly popular. Now, why were they wildly popular? Well, sure, they help folks in wheelchairs. But I would say that the population in wheelchairs that curb cuts help is about 3% of the overall population who use curb cuts. That's a guess. That's not an actual statistic. Think about how often we use curb cuts in our everyday life, from pushing a cart of groceries from the storefront down into the parking lot, down on the asphalt in the parking lot, to when you're riding a bike, getting from the street up to the sidewalk, to pushing a stroller. You don't want to push a stroller down a curb. I don't know how people did it with strollers before 1980. You know, pushing small children right down curbs doesn't really make sense to me. So the idea is that one accessibility measure for one group, seemingly for one group, and that is a group of folks in wheelchairs, paid off immensely for so many of us who use these resources on a daily basis. And what we found is that by making a computational chemistry lab accessible to me, and a lot of the practices which we use help not only me, but everyone who takes chemistry and studies chemistry in our lab. And my main rule, which my advisor affectionately calls Hobie's rule, is we're not going to do anything if it's just going to help me. It really needs to help. It needs to have potential to help everyone in the laboratory. So a little bit of background here, and that led to my understanding of universal accessibility and bringing that concept into the design work that I do today. And I offer universal accessibility to many companies, many food and beverage manufacturers, all the way to companies that work in Silicon Valley producing cell phones and computers and you name it. They all are excited to think more universally accessibly. And we're having fun sort of forging that front in the design industry right now. Now, I received my undergraduate degree at UC Davis in University of California, Davis. For those of you who don't know, in chemistry. I didn't know if chemistry was necessarily going to work for me, so I also pursued a degree in history, and understood that, finally was convinced that I could study graduate school, chemistry at the graduate level, when I met who would become my graduate advisor, Professor Dean Tantillo, as an undergraduate, and Chris Hammond, who's also a member of the Committee on Chemists with Disabilities, who was a wonderful undergraduate mentor and showed me, among many other things, that chemistry was entirely possible for a blind person to pursue. I studied in Dean's group for 2 years as an undergraduate before accepting an admission to UC Davis and attending graduate school at UC Davis as well. I'll talk to you just briefly about a lot of what we've found to make the laboratory accessible to me. And I won't go into any detail, huge detail there. And then I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm working on now in the design world. In Dean's group, we study computational organic chemistry. So we basically use methods that have been developed and theories that have been developed by programmers and physical chemists who love quantum mechanics and love math, and we apply them to organic systems and really elucidate, using those methods, reaction mechanisms. And we have a lot of fun doing it. Ultimately, the hard part of studying organic chemistry for me is getting a structure that I want to run quantum mechanics on from my mind into the computer. I'll talk to you a little bit about how we sort of went around that. And then ultimately getting the results from the computer back into my mind and onto my data sheet. Ashley mentioned the use of the software Gaussian. I also used Gaussian and the graphical user interface Gauss View, which she mentioned. I didn't contact the company, but I found plenty of workarounds that we implemented to make the chemistry that we do as accessible as possible to me. Ashley also alluded to the fact that we use 3D printing, and that is something I'd love to tell you about. We found, so one thing that I can absolutely access from the output files from our calculations is energy data. I can read through the thousands of print pages of output and figure out, okay, this is what I need. We actually created a lot of in-house scripts using Bash, Python, and Perl and it was exciting for me to learn how to program a little bit along the way there, to learn how to extract code we wrote code to extract various bits of information from those files, so I didn't have to scroll through the entire file using a text editor to find maybe 3 to 4 or 5 data points that I was after. The hard part of studying computational chemistry as a blind guy is understanding the structures when they're calculated. So when I'm talking to non-chemists, I usually describe it as what we do as basically finding both not only the lowest energy, but the lowest energy structural conformation that a particular molecule or system adopts. So it's a lot like setting a crazy feisty cat, on a pillow, and then lifting barriers around that pillow to confine the cat, and observing it basically figure out its position so that it's not mad anymore and it's happy to lay at rest on that pillow. It'll typically go from maybe a standing position down to a laying down position or whatever it may do. Now I can reach in there if I'm daring enough and don't mind getting bit or scratched and feel that cat, right? But one thing that's very hard is that I can't do is understand how the Gaussian software suite has used quantum mechanics and whatever level of theory that I use for my calculations to rearrange that molecule and ultimately feel it. My sighted peers can view a 3D rendering of that using a graphical user interface, but I can't do that myself. So back in 2010, when I was still an undergraduate, my advisor, Dr. Tantillo, applied for an NSF grant and was able to get that NSF grant to fund a 3D printer along with the Dean's office, the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at UC Davis, to fund an old school 3D printer, which is what I'm showing here on this slide. At this time, we used 3D printing to basically, the printer used plaster Paris and a jet of water on a print head to print and generate chemical structures that it printed in layers, okay? Layers about 0.03 of an inch thick, where a build bed, which is where the structure is built, rises up. It fills up with plaster Paris. The whole compartment fills up with plaster Paris. And then through that compartment runs a print head on a 3-dimensional arm. It runs in 2 dimensions and deposits a little bit of water wherever it needs to for one layer, and then rises up 0.03 of an inch and prints the next layer. And the idea there is that plaster of Paris hardens in the presence of water and creates sort of a cement-like consistency, so we're able to generate structures that way. Now, issues with this printer were many-fold. First and foremost, the printer that we used, I was not able to lift structures out easily without breaking them, because the structures that we print are not space-filling. They're typically ball and stick models, and being that there's a lot of space between sticks and spheres, if you will, there's a lot of room for breakage, and structures come out of this printer. I like to describe them as almost a freshly baked cookie. So they're very brittle, and then actually they can be either sprayed with about a 10 molar solution of Epsom salt, or deposited just for a few seconds in a bath of superglue, and that superglue basically enters the porous plaster Paris and hardens the structure and creates a much more sturdy structure. But until then, you have to dig through plaster powder to pull out and render those structures, which I was decent at, but ended up breaking a few structures along the way. When I got into graduate school, I received a fellowship from the National Science Foundation, a graduate research fellowship, wherein I was able to use additional funding there to purchase a new 3D printer, this one that you see here. This 3D printer is a much more modern printer that prints structures using ABS plastic, and that made it so that I could lift structures out, put structures in, and actually repair the printer really unassisted. So this printer is very exciting, and what you see inside is a structure with the door open that I studied that has to do with a molecule called 24-methylene cycloartenol, which is an indicator for thermally treated olive oil, which I worked on a lot in my lab, but I'll spare you the computational details of that project. So the new 3D printer created structures that were not brittle, and easily accessible by me and any other lab mates. And the beauty of this, what I'm telling you about now, is that all of my lab mates found and still find 3D printing to be very useful and accessible. And while they can see a rendering of their structures that they're examining for their calculations, for their projects on the screen, they found it to be wildly successful to hold these structures in their hands. Now, you might ask, okay, you have a calculation, you have an output file with a bunch of coordinates in it, and yes, fine, sighted people can see this on the screen with Gauss View, the software that we use, but how would a blind person go about accessing that information? I mean, and how would you take that information and go from that output file to a 3D printable input file, which has the format .stl, or stereolithographic file? And here's how. What I'm showing now is a collaboration with Professor Gert Vriend and Valer Launes at the university, at basically Nijmegen in the Netherlands, University of Nijmegen. We were able to build with them several software suites which accelerated and aided my education in graduate school. Mind you, these softwares are open source. They still need some additional work, which we're putting into them at the moment as we speak. But they still have a lot of work to be done to sort of update them, revamp them, and make them usable to the general public. But I will give you information, if desired, on how you might access the software suites that I'll tell you about now. We originally contacted the folks at Asterix, A-S-T-E-R-I, capital X, because they published a paper all about taking large protein database files, several hundred-page PDF files, with a combination of images and text, and extracted the images from those using a simple vector search. So they were able to search the files for images and then print those images in a separate PDF file. So you could take a file with a large jumble of images and text and generate a PDF file of both, one PDF file of the images and one of the text. And we thought, now this is amazing, because what if, I saw that paper and I immediately contacted my advisor at that time and said, Dean, we need to contact these people because what if I could input, one of the hardest parts about studying chemistry as a blind guy at the graduate level is reading the literature. Most people, when they see a paper, they read the abstract, they read the conclusion, and they skim the figures in organic. I can read the abstract, I can read the conclusion, no problem, but oftentimes authors write their papers in such a way that just little enough information is presented, so I can't get the whole picture without looking at the figures and the figures that they refer to. So I thought, what if I can take a PDF of a paper and then actually print out the figures as individual files? They got really, Dean said, great response. He said, yeah, great idea, hope we contact them. So I did. And they were inspired to work with me. I was inspired to work with them, and we put together wonderful software which used their asterisks and created larger. We found that the tactile resolution of the hand is about 250 to 300% of what the eye can see and what the eye likes to see. So something that looks good to you, we enlarged 3 times roughly for me to be able to feel accessibly. And we annotated these structures with Braille. And we used a machine called a Pictures in a Flash machine, which allows us to basically print them using laser printer technology on a paper that swells up when there's a black line on it when put in a special machine. And ultimately, we can print tactile images or raised images of printed files that way. So we would print these files out. They would have Braille on them that would raise up in a Braille font that would be printed, and then it would raise up into dots that I could feel. But ultimately, what we found is that papers have such varying styles of figure, and even in like one given paper, any given paper, an author will choose several different ways to present a figure, or present several figures. So I need figures to be built up slowly when I feel them, so that I'm not feeling a jumble of information, and oftentimes 3D renderings of things that are made to look 3D, but believe me, in 2 dimensions do not feel 3D. So that ultimately didn't necessarily work for me to access all papers. It works for some very simple articles where I already knew some of the figures, but I have found that working with an assistant is indeed the best way to access the chemical literature, which does take a lot of time. However, these guys were excited and nerdy like me, and we got talking and decided that, you know, we're really interested in 3D printing, but one of the hardest things about 3D printing in the Tantillo lab is that we cannot print molecules short of using an AutoCAD or CAD software for architecture, which was completely inaccessible to me. So I had to get assistance generating my 3D prints, and that wasn't good enough. So I started talking with them and ultimately working with them and learning Fortran, which is the code that they knew from the 70s, and a little bit of C. And we worked together to build a software suite where I could input any output file from Gaussian, those are called log files, and generate from the last structure, the last set of coordinates, a 3D printable file, an STL file of that structure. We essentially, I'll spare you the details, but we essentially used vector and point technology to look at where spheres and sticks were, and plot molecules. Given all the points, we would just make a plot of that. And then we actually used triangular integration, so not using rectangles, but using triangles to ultimately tile 3 space with that structure and create a mesh, which then can be imported to a 3D printable file, to an STL file, and create an image with spheres and sticks. Now, the most exciting breakthrough that I had with this was that shortly after we developed the base code that just would generate the structure for me, I was able to implement Braille and annotate these structures with Braille so that when printed on the plastic printer, I can read off the bond length of any structure or angle or dihedral angle, whatever I want, or all if I wish, in picometers from my calculation. So if Gaussian, the software used, calculates that a carbon-carbon bond is 1.55 angstroms, I would read right off that bond that that's, yes, 155 picometers. And indeed, that worked out, and it was very exciting. We also created a system using Asterisk BVI, which utilizes basically a dictionary of built structures using SMILES, Simplified Molecular Input Line Entry Specification, wherein I can both use commands and SMILES strings that I know to build molecules up piece by piece. I then can run a script which converts that to a COM file, and essentially, which is the input file for Gaussian, which is what Ashley was talking about, building using the Gauss view, the graphical user interface, and then ultimately I can submit that COM file for whatever calculation I wish. And we got to a point where I had races with my sighted peers who were using the graphical user interface to build structures, and I was able to build a buckyball faster than they were. So it was a lot of fun there, using Asterisk BVI and the system that we came up with. I've used 3D printing and all of what I've described in the in-house scripts that we've written for all of my projects. What I'm showing here is the transition state of a 1,2 hydride shift in 24-methylene cycloartanol converting to an isomerized product, which is a potential indicator, as I said before, of thermally treated olive oil. Basically, if you heat up I'm going to explain this in the shortest possible way that I can. If you heat up 24-methylene cycloartanol to above about 40 degrees Celsius, it runs through a 1,2 hydride shift, followed by a deprotonation to isomerize into a different product. And I was able to fully investigate that mechanism and then publish those results using no assistance and 3D printing. We also used other techniques that we developed, basically of scanning to find transition state structures. So I can either scan bond length, bond angle, or dihedral angle, and then generate, using Excel, a graph of those scans that I run. I can find the high points and low points of those scans, and then I can correlate the high point. If I'm running a scan, I can correlate the high point to a potential transition state structure. I can extract that from those coordinates from my scan file, create an input file, and run that as a putative transition state optimization to see, which then can be verified with accessible intrinsic reaction coordinate calculations to arrive at whether or not that indeed is a sufficient transition state structure. So it's been very exciting. It's been a wonderful process coming up with ways to make chemistry fully accessible to me. This should have a video that I'm excited about because I was able to build this in PowerPoint. Do we see the video of the hydrogen moving? Yep, so the hydrogen is actually moving from one carbon to another, and that's showing the 1,2 hydride shift, which I'm, again, sparing you the details of, which I was able to calculate using completely accessible technology. I decided after studying chemistry as an undergraduate that, I had a lot of support and a lot of amazing people behind me. I'd been to several national programs for the blind in terms of getting us excited about science and motivated to study science, offered by the National Federation of the Blind in collaboration with NASA. But I realized that students around me in my area were not getting the same, blind students around me were not getting the same level of support, and I knew several who wanted to study science. So in 2011, concurrent with my finishing of graduate school, my undergraduate tenure, I decided to hold a camp, a chemistry camp, wherein we would run hands-on chemistry experiments and have faculty from UC Davis come in and basically present on how to do chemistry accessible. That led to the Foundation of Accessible Science, whose mission you can see here, and we were able to really start a chemistry camp and a trend. We've just led our 7th camp, and we've had students come in, blind or visually impaired students from all around the country, all around the United States, as well as internationally from Mexico and beyond. So it's been a great experience for me running that organization and building up people's confidence to study chemistry and to be powerful thinkers and excited scientists. I'd love to tell you more about accessible science offline. You can also take a look at our organization and all that we have to offer at accessiblescience.org. Finally, I'm showing a picture of a vineyard and a molecule. I found a passion for sensory design through my work with Francis Ford Coppola, innovating completely blind wine tastings back in 2011, ironically concurrent with my graduate tenure. And ultimately, I've found a job as a designer where I use the chemistry that I know, mainly general chemistry, on a daily basis. And I've found ways to pair art with science. So we really straddle that very fine intersection between art, the arts that we know about and think about, and the science that we do on a day-to-day basis. And I've come up with the following simple definition, which is that, in my opinion, science fills our toolbox with tools that we can use and implement and basically build things with. But art dictates how we use those tools, how we build things, how we think. So we need science, but we also absolutely need art and business to apply the science that we all know so well. With that, I'd like to thank, of course, the Tantilla Group at UC Davis, SensePoint Design, of which I co-founded, the Committee on Chemists with Disabilities, and Lee and Prof for putting this wonderful symposium on. I believe I went just a touch over time, and I'm sorry about that. I'd love to take any questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
For more information, please contact us at cwd@acs.org. Check out these other videos and follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @ACS_CWD. Also connect with us on Facebook at cwd.acs/. This video is brought to you by the American Chemical Society, the world's largest scientific society.